Hello, my name is Héroux, Professor of Toxicology and Health Effects of Electromagnetism in the Department of Epidemiology, Biostatistics and Occupational Health at McGill University. Here are more details on my credentials, which you may examine at your leisure. Since time for this presentation is limited, I proceed immediately to the meat of the matter, which is an exploration of where the safety limits for electromagnetic exposure come from and where they are going. This presentation addresses mostly basic science questions in the hope of solidifying the social position of electrosensitive people whose very existence is often even cast into doubt. The politics of non-thermal electromagnetic radiation protection. Institutions like the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, and the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, ICNIRP, are the current caretakers of industry orientations that were taken a long time ago. The FCC is a U.S. agency with no indigenous health expertise, and so it relies on other U.S. agencies for health advice, specifically the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and the Food and Drug Administration, FDA. FCC's effective role is simply to manage the expansion of the wireless industry. The EPA terminated its programs dealing with non-ionizing radiation protection long ago, and some of you may have heard of the difficulties first faced by Dr. Carl Blackman to maintain his NTER research activities there. The FDA has repeatedly proven to be tributary to various industries. This was particularly evident in the events that followed the release of the results of the National Toxicology Program on cell phone dangers, when there was considerable pressure to weaken the study results released to the public. In the USA, the possibilities for better control of NTER seems to die in an interagency quagmire. Support for the current situation comes from decisions at the higher levels of the US government, which can be explained by basically two large influences, military and commerce, with which concerns for population health cannot compete. So what is the influence of the military? Although radios like the BC-1000 were occasionally available in World War I, their influence in war was usually marginal. For most Navy boats in the 1930s, the only alert of the approach of enemy torpedo planes came from sailors with binoculars. But that changed rapidly with the deployment of radar, and in the Second World War, radio and radar had become essential to the conduct of effective warfare. This love affair between the military and wireless would only be amplified in the years following the deployment of computers. In the present times, coordination between land, sea, air, even space forces relies increasingly on reliable use of the electromagnetic spectrum. To quote a U.S. Department of Defense report, the nation has entered an age of war fighting wherein the U.S. dominance in air, land, sea, space, cyberspace, and the electromagnetic spectrum is challenged by peer and near-peer adversaries. These challenges have exposed the cross-cutting reliance of U.S. forces on the electromagnetic spectrum and are driving a change in how the Department of Defense approaches activities in the electromagnetic spectrum to maintain an all-domain advantage. For many years, to speak of health effects of NTER in the United States was seen as unpatriotic. In conclusion, military applications are a pivotal reason why so many countries support wireless development. So, a few quotations. It recognizes that the same technology used to enable the maneuverability required in the highly contested near-peer environment can also be used to enhance access in highly regulated peacetime environments. They're using the same techniques. Incorporate technical innovations is important, focused on repurposing spectrum to stimulate economic growth through commercial applications. The Department of Defense recognizes the importance of U.S. wireless leadership to the nation's economic prosperity, and 5G technologies mark a critical pivot for spectrum policy, technology innovation, and national security. The Department's ability to achieve freedom of action in the electromagnetic spectrum at the time and place of its choosing is critical to all domain advantage for U.S. allied and partner forces for decisive military overmatch. Additionally, the Department of Defense must continue to widen engagement to advance development of sharing technologies to satisfy the growing commercial and national security requirements for spectrum access. Data-driven solutions that will ensure superiority over our adversaries and keep pace with technology industry. So basically, there is a narrative that shows wireless as a great boom to the US economy. But in fact, wireless is something very different. Wireless, in great part embodied by cellular phones, is of course a great convenience. But in terms of economic productivity, data shows that it is a negative impact on the economy. And this is demonstrated by US government statistics. So this kind of story that is promoted by wireless, that wireless will make us prosperous and rich, is extremely biased. The only people that will really get rich are the wireless companies. What is the influence now of industry? The US military, even in the tri-service era, knew full well about the risks, the chronic risks of electromagnetic field exposure. And that is why tests conducted by the military were acute tests primarily focused on interference with reflexes and decision-making relevant to war operations, essentially of their soldiers. The results by DeLorge, which were primarily retained to seek the military exposure limits, used a very small number of animals and exposure sessions, 8 rats and 5 monkeys, typically 3 sessions, as well as remarkably short durations, 40 minutes in rats and 60 minutes in monkeys. An even more disturbing question is whether a single acute behavioral response is appropriate for general and long-term toxicity determinations. The military are fundamentally accepting of risks. Colonel Brady would openly say in meetings, people often get hurt in the service. And since wars are not lost because of cancer or other chronic diseases, relatively high thermal limits were ultimately adopted by the military. What really hurt the environment is when these military limits were adopted for civilian life by organizations like the Institute of Electronic and Electrical Engineers. The basic question here is the level of exposure acceptable to a pilot in a Eurofighter acceptable for your 6-year-old in primary school? And is this exposure acceptable lifelong? At the moment when decisions were still possible in 1960, a number of organizations were using different limits according to their field of activity. You will note in this slide that the limits follow activities according to military, heating applications, and telecommunications. The Soviets had strict stricter limits because they base their restrictions on effects observed in the nervous system of animals, which is the proper model to assess something like this. For many years, there were apparent discussions on the science surrounding health effects of electromagnetic radiation. But in my opinion, it was more of a public relations show to bring on board an engineering community that was relatively ignorant of biological matters that now reaches close to 1 million members. So basically, they needed to be recruited as a convinced group that health effects of electromagnetic radiation were thermal only. This large population of promoters of wireless would be used later to convince governments to adopt thermal health limits. In other words, Alan Frey, depicted on the left here, never had a chance against Hermann Schwann, that was specifically recruited by industry for this purpose. The distorted scientific discussion that was conducted in these years was described in a thesis by Don Maish of Australia as a Procrustean approach, in that all data was made to fit in a single bed, the thermal paradigm, which resulted in the exposure limits that industry wanted to see. Today, we have various suggestions for protections against electromagnetic radiation exposures. It is clear that the thermalist view inherited by the FCC at the bottom here is quite different from the advice of organizations here that are actually interested in health protection, like the European Academy of Environmental Medicine, the Austrian Medical Association, IGNIR, and Bobiology. It is also clear that the composition of the committees making these decisions are pivotal. We see here the composition of IEEE's 1966 Thermalist Committee, which is dominated by the United States Armed Forces, followed by the Petroleum Institute, Space Administration, General Dynamics, the US Treasury, and a meager representative, probably carefully chosen from the US Public Health Service. And we can see the difference with the group gathered by the European Academy for Environmental Medicine, which is made of environmental physicians, some electrical engineering, public health, medical research. Could the thermalist limits be justified by cogent science? This is important because ultimately science can be used in court to restore common sense to NTER exposure limits. Surprisingly, the arguments used by industry to expand military limits to civil ones are based on extremely fragile arguments that can better be described as red herrings. Unfortunately, this procedure may take time because, as the saying goes, commerce takes the elevator while science takes the stairs. And this is particularly true for health science. The power and wireless industries have claimed that the health effects of non-ionizing electromagnetic radiation are impossible because the emissions are non-ionizing and too weak to heat tissues. Industry has used these two arguments to seat its demonstration that NTER in the environment is inoffensive. It has also repeatedly said that biological evidence of harm was hard to reproduce and could not be used to develop protective limits because of its complexity. These arguments are also not convincing because biological evidence in this field is always difficult to reproduce because of two unavoidable elements: the complexity of exposures and the complexity of biological systems. What was probably true was that the engineering community was unfamiliar with this type of evidence and did not accept the interpretation of biological evidence given by biologists. What is certainly true is that the engineering community never wanted to know much about biology in fear that the results would undermine their expansion plan. What about the argument that the radiation is non-ionizing? The non-ionizing argument is based on a simple equation derived for gases, yes, gases, by Arrhenius in 1889. Using the concept of energy of activation here, it is easy to show that the energy of RF radiation is too small to ionize molecules. You have here the number of joules contained in a quantum of radio frequency radiation. So consequently, ionization is impossible. Wow, this is great. Too weak to heat tissues. The thermal energy of water molecules is so much, while the energy contained in radio frequencies is only so much. So any effect of the radiation will be overwhelmed by thermal energy. The second argument that RF radiation is too small to heat tissues refers to the fact that the energy of water molecules is higher than the energy that can be delivered by the radiation. Consequently, the reasoning is made that radiation energy will be totally overwhelmed. Even a basic knowledge of physics may lead one to ask why metallic antennas can be used in practice to detect tiny levels of electromagnetic radiation in spite of their high temperature. Why are electrons moved by EMR in an antenna not overwhelmed by thermal energy? Isn't that strange? A correct view of the physics and biology involved shows that these two preceding arguments are worthless in addressing health impacts of electromagnetic radiation. In fact, genuine science says that health impacts of non-ionizing electromagnetic radiation are inevitable. The proof is based on three unassailable scientific principles. Those three principles: the second law of thermodynamics from physics, the anatomy of oxidative phosphorylation from biology, and Maxwell's equations. So here we show a DNA molecule in a transmission electron micrograph of the cross-section of C. elegans nose. These structures show a high level of organization. Entropy is a very important concept in physics, as it even determines the arrow of time. So entropy is S right here. The equation delta S larger than 0 means that a process that shows organization must balance its activity by disorganization elsewhere. Disorganization is generated in chemistry by free radicals. So, this need for life to generate free radicals is what Erwin Schrödinger, the same guy who has the cat in the box, described in 1944 as feeding on negative entropy or negentropy. It has long been acknowledged that free radicals are present in biology, but few biologists would mention that their obligatory existence is due to entropy. And these free radicals are an obligation, not an option. The free radicals of biology are produced by metabolism, which everybody, I believe, recognizes exists, mostly by a process called oxidative phosphorylation. This process happens to create continuous flow of electrons and protons over significant distances at the cellular scale. Oxidative phosphorylation proposes that electron and proton currents are central to life, and that was proposed in 1961 by Peter Mitchell. This physiology was in all biology textbooks by 1975 and had been fully accepted by 1978 when Mitchell was awarded the Nobel Prize. So this was way before the year 2000 or surrounding, when protection against RF radiation was solidified by the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers. So how could they be ignorant of this science? This slide shows diagrammatically the electron here and proton paths here in the mitochondria present in all our cells. In black, the electron transport chain. As I showed, the blue arrows show the proton transport circuit. This slide here shows the saturation of all parts of human bodies with small currents of electrons and protons that need to flow continuously for life to be sustained. Metabolism establishes from 0.2 to 18 quintillion electron and proton paths, 100 to 200 nanometers long in the human body. This continuous flow of charges, currents, can be detected even in the bulk properties of biological tissues. This slide shows results of an experiment I performed on the brains of animals immediately after oxygen flow is interrupted. As metabolism stops and electron and proton currents stop, there is a large change in the bulk of electrical properties of tissues. You can see there, this is when the tissue is oxygenated, and this is 6 minutes later, which is 4 minutes after blood flow interruption. And you see that all across the spectrum of frequencies here, large changes in impedance in the tissue occurs. And this change is most pronounced in the tissue, the brain, that is most dependent, you can see here, on oxygen supply. What this means is that oxygen stoppage interrupts the flow of electrons and protons in the brain, and does so quite rapidly. Into the last argument of our proof, all we have to point out is that if currents are already flowing when tissue is alive, these currents will act as antennas that can be perturbed by any external electromagnetic field. There is no need for ionization, as industry claims, as the body provides this ionization by itself. There is no need for high field intensity, as freely flowing currents in the body will react to any level of external electromagnetic influence. Now, a little bit of perspective. Since the dawn of human civilization, we have seen the sun as a benefactor, often a god. The sun allows ice to become water and is essential for life. But at a fundamental level, any radiation, including that of the sun, has the potential to destabilize life. So our adulation for the sun should be revised into a more balanced view. Life is exquisitely sensitive to all electromagnetic radiation. The only reason why we can tolerate the sun and the Earth's magnetic field is because we have lived in these conditions forever. We have evolution to thank. Billions of years have made us resistant to this radiation. Looking back to the decisions of the IEEE in setting standards for RF protection in 2005, which were based on the activation of chemical reactions, how could IEEE not have known that an equation superior to the Arrhenius equation, since it is valid in liquids, was derived by Héroux in 1935? But this would have meant discussing a number of reactions in biology that depends on Gibbs free energy, which is delta G here. Then how could IEEE not have known that Bennett-Chandler had an even better expression that included a compilation of entropy changes, delta S here? Did they ignore this because taking into account entropy, delta S, would have led them to the inevitability of metabolism? In their assumptions of EMR safety, IEEE pontified that there were no currents flowing in your body, which means essentially that you are dead. Did the IEEE neglect to notice that we are alive? Well, I think that the answer is that expanding industries often do not notice other stakeholders in society, like living beings, and then compose a thermalist narrative to obscure their own blindness. But we can we can say that we cannot say that we were not warned about allowing professional organizations to make safety rules. Adam Smith, the high priest of capitalism, warned us against this huge risk in 1776. And this huge risk is normally limited by, in your case, your Italian government. Did your Italian government protect you? So technology can do wonders, but can also oversupply its product, in this case electromagnetic radiations, simply because it wants to grow. The way wireless has developed until now is clearly not in recognition of the sensitivity of living systems to radiation. And now to 5G. The wireless industry deliberately ignores the health impacts of its electromagnetic emissions and aims to maximize its commercial footprint. After data densification through frequency division multiple access, FDMA, and time division multiple access, TDMA, it adds now space division multiple access, as shown in this illustration, through beamforming and multiple input, multiple output. The wireless industry is facing strict limits in terms of available spectrum and in the performance of filters which allow extraction of signal from noise. All possible engineering solutions will be entertained to increase profits, which are tightly tied to data densification. That means that the human environment will become increasingly unhealthy unless barriers are imposed through regulation. What is their plan? The wireless industry in its present embodiment is the enemy of all humanity, but the immediate enemy of the electrosensitive. Wireless has repeatedly demonstrated that it fits its distorted vision of human vulnerability to EMR to the needs of its wireless techniques. Over time, they have reclassified your body parts, the ear, when convenient. For 5G, they are planning to increase the body's tolerance to heat from 1 degree to as much as 5 degree rise in temperature. They are planning to limit exposures based on variables that are more permissive, going from specific absorption rate to power density. All these changes are in the hands of an engineering community deliberately ignorant of the properties of living systems. Conclusion. Although it is tempting for electrosensitive people to perceive themselves as victims, we should never lose sight of the fact that we suffer from an affliction that impacts everyone through other diseases, although the majority of the population is blissfully unaware. In our role as guardians of health and perhaps of the human race, we should view ourselves as the priests of old, burdened by the task of leading society to a better destiny. In that perspective, and in spite of our afflictions, we should endeavor to become more visible and vocal. Usque tandem abutere, patientia nostra. By insisting that our health be respected by serious accommodations, we will awaken the unsuspecting majority to a peril it cannot see. In our quest to tame the new electromagnetic environment, we are fighting for our health, but also for the health of all. Thank you very much.